Welcome to Cogito Ergo Pod. I am your host Daniel, and this is the podcast dedicated to discussing, delving, and dissecting a variety of areas in theology, philosophy, mysticism, and the esoteric. It's been a while since I've been with you, and I have to say it's been quite a year, but I'm back now, and I would like to continue with the series that I was looking at all the way back at the start of the year, and that has been a series of episodes dedicated to the subject of evil and suffering in the Bible. Today, we're deep diving into a fundamental and foundational set of literary and theological texts, the New Testament Gospels, to tackle a subject that is both philosophically and psychologically fascinating, the nature of evil. When we hear the words gospel, which translates to good news, we often think of concepts like love, forgiveness, and enlightenment. But the power of these narratives, from a literary standpoint, is only truly understood when you see what the protagonist is up against. The Gospels present a world that is deeply broken, actively opposed by dark forces, both human and, in the texts, claim something else. So for this episode, we're not debating the metaphysical truth of these events. Instead, we're doing a literary and philosophical analysis. What evil is according to the authors of the Gospels, and how does it function in these stories? But before we break down the types of evil, we have to ask a crucial question. Why is evil represented this way in the first place? What was happening in the world that shaped this specific worldview? The worldview of the Gospels didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was forged in a crucible of political, cultural, and theological turmoil. There are three key historical contexts you must understand. First, the rise of Jewish apocalypticism. This was a worldview that flourished in the Second Temple period, especially under centuries of brutal foreign occupation. First the Greeks, and now the Romans. When your earthly reality is one of political powerlessness and oppression, your theology can shift. The battle is no longer just on earth, it becomes cosmic. This apocalyptic worldview creates a strong dualism. It's not just God, it's God versus an active, intelligent adversary, whether it be Satan, Beelzebub, or the prince of this world. Earthly events, like the Roman occupation, are seen as mere symbols of this greater supernatural war. Some scholars also point to a possible influence from Zoroastrianism, which Jews encountered during the Persian period. This system's powerful dualism between a supremely good deity and a coexisting evil spirit may have sharpened Judaism's own developmental ideas about a chief antagonist. Secondly, the reality of the Roman occupation has to be considered. This is the air of the character's breath. The world of the Gospels is an occupied territory. Roman rule was often brutal. Crucifixion wasn't just a method of execution, it was a public tool of state terror, reserved for rebels, slaves, and enemies of the state. This is the systemic evil we'll see in figures like Pilate. Thirdly, there was a strong sense and intense feeling of Jewish sectarianism. First century Judea was not monolithic. It was a hotbed of competing Jewish sects, whether they be Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, all intensely debating the correct way to be faithful to God under occupation. The Gospels are, in part, polemics. They are arguments from one of these new movements, early Christianity, against the others. The evil of the Pharisees, as depicted, is the evil of religious rivals who, in the author's view, are getting it wrong. So with that lens, apocalypticism, Roman occupation, and Jewish sectarianism, the three types of evil in the Gospels make perfect historic sense. The first and most obvious form of evil, born from apocalyptic worldview, is supernatural and personified. Right at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, he has a direct, philosophical duel with a character named Satan, or the devil. This involves temptations of provision, stones to bread, power, kingdoms of the world, and spiritual hubris, testing God. But this confrontation doesn't end in the desert. His entire ministry is framed as an ongoing battle with unclean spirits and demons. In Mark's Gospel, his first public act of power is an exorcism in a synagogue. The texts mention Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. There is the story of the Syrophoenician woman arguing to heal her daughter, severely oppressed by a demon. The most dramatic example is the Gerasene demoniac, the man living in the tombs breaking chains. When Jesus asks this man his name, the response is chilling. "My name is Legion, for we are many." In the worldview of the Gospels, this kind of evil is a force that dehumanizes. It strips the person of their identity, community, and sanity. The exorcisms are so central that his opponents are forced to respond. In Matthew 12, after Jesus heals a man who was blind, mute, and demon-possessed, the Pharisees don't deny the power, they reattribute the source. They say, "It is only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons." Beelzebub, or Baal-zebul, a pagan deity reimagined as a chief demon. Jesus' rebuttal is pure logic. Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste. If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? Jesus frames his mission as a cosmic invasion, plundering evil's house. The second type of evil is the one we have discussed, the evil baked into systems of power, namely the Roman occupation. Let's look at King Herod. In Matthew's Gospel, this is Herod the Great, a Roman client king and a notorious tyrant. The historian Josephus tells us he was pathologically paranoid, executing his own wife and several of his sons. So when Matthew's Gospel describes him ordering the massacre of the innocents, it's a brilliant piece of characterization. While the event itself isn't verified by other sources, it's exactly the kind of paranoid, brutal act the real Herod was known for. And then we have Pontius Pilate. The historical Pilate, according to contemporary sources like Philo and Josephus, was a brutal and inflexible Roman prefect. But the Gospels show him as something else, a weak-willed cynic. He famously asks, "What is truth?" as if the very concept is a waste of his time. He knows Jesus is innocent, but the crowd is rowdy. So, in one of the most symbolic acts in the entire text, Pilate washes his hands. He performs his own innocence while sentencing an innocent man to a brutal death to maintain public order. This is the evil of indifference, of moral cowardice, and of a corrupt justice system. This last category, rooted in that context of Jewish sectarianism, is the evil that comes from inside the human heart. And where does the protagonist find its most potent expression? Ironically, among the religious elite. His harshest words are reserved for the Pharisees and scribes. In Matthew 23, he calls them hypocrites, blind guides, and whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of death and decay on the inside. From the text's perspective, their evil wasn't that they broke the rules, it was that they weaponized the rules. Jesus points out their obsession with external purity, washing hands and cups, while ignoring internal corruption like evil thoughts, murder, adultery, and theft. Jesus cites the Korban rule, where he accuses them of teaching that a man can dedicate property to God specifically to avoid using that money to care for his elderly parents. They are using a loophole of religious piety to break a core moral commandment. And finally, we have the evil within the inner circle and the evil of the crowd. First, Judas Iscariot, a figure who deserves his own episode in a future time. His betrayal for 30 pieces of silver is the ultimate personal transgression. The Gospel's portrayal is psychologically fascinating. John's Gospel paints him as a common thief. Other interpreters have suggested that he was a political zealot, disillusioned that Jesus wasn't the military Messiah he wanted. John's Gospel also adds that supernatural layers stating Satan entered him. It's a terrifying fusion of human failure and personified evil. And then there's the crowd. This is perhaps the most chilling part. On Palm Sunday, they all shouted Hosanna. 5 days later, the same crowd, whipped up by the chief priests, are screaming, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" This is the evil of the mob. A narrative drives this home with the choice of Barabbas. Pilate offers them a choice: Jesus or a man named Barabbas, described as a rebel and murderer. The crowd, in their madness, chooses the violent insurrectionist over the radical pacifist. It's a stunning depiction of how easily human loyalty can be manipulated. So, when you analyze the Gospels as literature, and you set them against their proper historical backdrop, you see that evil isn't simply one thing. It's a complex, multifaceted force. It's the supernatural antagonist of an apocalyptic world, the legion that dehumanizes. It's the systemic evil of Roman occupation, of a paranoid king and an indifferent Pontius Pilate. And it's an internal evil of sectarian conflict, the whitewashed tomb, the hypocrisy of the religious, the tragic failure of a friend like Judas, and the terrifying, fickle nature of the mob. The good news of the gospel as a narrative is not a denial of this evil. On the contrary, the text takes evil incredibly seriously. The entire point of the story is the protagonist's confrontation with all of it, culminating in his submission to it, and in the text's view, his ultimate victory over it. That's all we have time for today. I hope you have enjoyed this new look, this new streamlined version of the podcast. If you find this kind of deep dive into theology, philosophy, and esoteric valuable, please make sure to follow or subscribe to Cogito Ergo Pod wherever you get your podcasts. It's the best way to help us find new listeners. And if you'd like to support the show, please get in touch. We'd love to hear your ideas and your opinions about how this podcast can grow. We're an independent production, and your support helps us keep these conversations going, and maybe one day the light's on. So for now, thank you for joining me on Cogito Ergo Pod, and I shall speak to you again soon.